You know that dusty corner of every American flea market? The one with the chipped coffee mugs and rusty tools? Well, sometimes, nestled between a broken lawnmower and a box of romance novels, you find things that were forgotten on purpose. Things with stories attached. Today, we're not looking for bargains. We're looking at 49 reasons why some things should have stayed buried, lost, or preferably, on fire. 1. Imagine sifting through dusty crates of forgotten music when you stumble upon it. A single scratched-up vinyl record. There's no sleeve, no artist, not even a song title. Just a few words scrawled on the label in what looks like dried blood, but is probably just a red marker. Play at your own risk. The vendor, a man who looked like he'd seen one too many strange things, mumbled it was salvaged from an abandoned radio station. Naturally, curiosity got the better of some poor soul. They took it home, dropped the needle, and got nothing but static for 2 long minutes. Then, just as they reached to turn it off, a chillingly clear voice whispered from the speakers, "You shouldn't have done that." The record immediately fell silent and has never made another sound since. So now they own a useless piece of vinyl and a brand new lifelong fear of their stereo system. 2. Down in Florida, where reality always seems a bit negotiable, a vendor was selling a collection of vintage clown shoes with a very specific disclaimer: lightly haunted. According to the seller, these weren't aggressively possessed. No, that would be extra. These floppy monstrosities belonged to a long-dead circus performer whose spirit just couldn't retire. He still wanted to perform. What does a lightly haunted shoe even do? Does it spontaneously squeak during a serious moment? Does it trip you into a conveniently placed cream pie? It's the perfect item for someone who wants to invite the paranormal into their home but isn't ready for a full-on demonic commitment. It's not horror. It's horror adjacent. 3. Some flea market finds are weird, and some just spit in the face of physics. Case in point, a large ornate mirror that only reflected people. Not the room they were in, not the furniture behind them, nothing. Just the person, floating in an unsettling empty black void like a poorly rendered video game character. The truly unnerving part, though, was the lag. When you moved, your reflection would hesitate for just a fraction of a second before catching up. It was a tiny delay, but just long enough for your brain to short-circuit, screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. You weren't just looking at a reflection, you were looking at something else that was looking back at you. And frankly, its reaction time was a little poor. 4. You find a tattered old leather notebook that feels oddly heavy. You open it, expecting a forgotten diary or maybe some bad poetry. Instead, you find pages filled with nothing but names and addresses. Hundreds of them, written in a cramped, urgent script. There's no explanation or context. The most chilling detail? Many of the names have been methodically crossed out with a single dark line. The seller swore he pulled it from inside a wall during an abandoned house demolition. But the real horror sinks in when you realize some of the addresses, the ones not yet crossed out, are for houses in your own town. Suddenly, this isn't just a weird antique, it's a to-do list, and you have no idea if it's finished. 5. Tucked between rusty tools and chipped dishware sat a legitimate, no-joke time machine. And by that, I mean it was a 1980s microwave oven duct taped to a car battery, with a satellite dish glued to the top. The seller, with the unshakable confidence of a man who has stared into the abyss and tried to cook a Hot Pocket with it, claimed it was almost finished. It just needed to be tuned to the correct chronal frequency to work. He offered no demonstrations and, of course, had a very strict no refunds policy. I have to wonder about the person who bought it. Are they currently hobnobbing with dinosaurs? Or did they just discover the most spectacular way to blow every fuse in their house? 6. If you're going to buy a haunted doll, you might as well get one with a gimmick. A seller in Pennsylvania was offering an antique porcelain doll that, she swore, would cry real tears every single night. Not just a spooky vibe, but actual, physical weeping. She even gave buyers a scientific sounding out. It could just be condensation from temperature changes. A brilliant sales tactic. It gives the logical part of your brain an excuse to buy it, while the rest of you is already picturing this glassy-eyed thing sobbing in the guest room at 3 in the morning. Is it atmospheric moisture or the unending sorrow of a tiny, trapped soul? For 50 bucks, some people were apparently willing to find out. 7. Here's a piece of art that comes with its own health warnings. A vendor was selling what he explicitly called a cursed painting, and he wasn't being subtle about it. In fact, the curse was its main selling point. He swore that every previous owner had returned it, complaining of splitting headaches, sudden bouts of nausea, and terrifyingly vivid nightmares, all starting the day they hung it up. The subject? A portrait of a woman with sad, dark eyes that seemed to stare right into your soul. And it wasn't even a good painting. Yet people were interested. It's a testament to human nature that you can market something as guaranteed to make you physically ill and miserable. And someone will still say, perfect, it'll really tie the room together. 8. Just when you think you've seen the absolute weirdest thing humanity has to offer, a flea market in Texas will always raise the bar. Someone was selling a collection of old baby dolls. From a distance, they looked normal. But as you got closer, you noticed something deeply, profoundly wrong with their smiles. The vendor had painstakingly removed the cheap plastic teeth and replaced them with real, very human teeth. Molars, canines, the whole 9 yards. When asked the most obvious question in the history of mankind, why? The seller simply shrugged and said, with a straight face, "They just look more realistic this way." Realistic to whom? A cannibal? You don't just walk away from a stall like that, you run. 9. In a corner piled high with forgotten treasures, there was a single, dusty perfume bottle. The handwritten label was simple and haunting. For those who have left. The seller, a woman with a mischievous glint in her eye, claimed it had a beautiful floral scent, but only if you smelled it while you were alone. If anyone else was in the room, she insisted, it smelled exactly like rotting wood. Naturally, someone bought it to test this bizarre claim. They went home, ensured they were completely alone, and sprayed it into the air. The scent that filled the room wasn't flowers. It was the damp, unmistakable smell of decay. So either the seller was a liar, or the definition of alone is a lot more flexible than they thought. 10. Sometimes the weirdest items aren't objects, but ongoing events. A seller presented a single blank piece of antique parchment in a frame. He explained that he'd left it on his table one evening and returned the next morning to find a message written in an unfamiliar, spidery handwriting. The message read, "Don't read out loud." Spooked, he left it. The next day, those words were gone, replaced by a new, more insistent message. "I said don't." So what we have here is a haunted object that is not only self-aware, but is also getting increasingly passive-aggressive. It's less of a terrifying curse and more like having a paranormal roommate who leaves you threatening sticky notes. 11. You can find a lot of old board games at flea markets, but rarely one with such a dramatic backstory. A vendor was selling a vintage Ouija board that had a large, ugly burn mark on one corner, charring the "goodbye" at the bottom. When a customer pointed it out, the seller just smirked and said, "Previous owner tried to destroy it. It didn't work." That single sentence is a masterclass in sales. It's simultaneously the most compelling marketing pitch ever and the single greatest reason to turn around and walk away. You're not just buying a game, you're buying something that has already survived an exorcism by fire. No refunds, I'm guessing. 12. Here's a find that specializes in subtle, creeping dread. Someone bought an old, thrifted picture frame, not paying much attention to the simple child's crayon drawing inside it. They hung it on their wall. A few days later, they noticed the little crayon stick figure, originally drawn in the center of the page, was now standing near the left edge. They assumed they were imagining things. But the next week, it was on the right. Then, one morning, they found the figure pressed right up against the edge of the paper, looking not at the crayon sun in the sky, but directly out of the frame. At them. Suddenly, that cute drawing isn't so cute anymore. 13. You expect to find old furniture and maybe a rusty saw at a Texas flea market. You do not expect to find a fully operational, 6-foot-tall guillotine. A vendor was selling this historic piece of hardware, casually describing it as being for decorative purposes. You know, for when you want your living room to have that certain French Revolution aesthetic. The blade was still sharp and the mechanism was in working order. As if that wasn't enough of a red flag, the seller cheerfully added, "Technically, it still works." I'm sorry, what part of a functional guillotine is decorative? It's the ultimate solution for dealing with noisy neighbors, I suppose, but a nightmare for your homeowner's insurance. 14. Amidst piles of old National Geographics and romance novels, there was a massive leather-bound book that looked ancient. Every single page was filled with intricate handwritten text and bizarre diagrams, but none of it was in any recognizable language. It was a chaotic mess of symbols that looked vaguely alchemical and vaguely alien. When asked about its origin, the seller just shrugged, saying, "It's been in my family for generations. No idea what it says." It was the flea market version of the Voynich manuscript. Is it the lost key to eternal life? A cookbook from another dimension? Or just the result of somebody's grandpa having way too much time on his hands? 15. Ventriloquist dummies are already charter members of the Uncanny Valley Hall of Fame. But this one was special. A vendor in Missouri was selling an old cracked wooden dummy named Chester, and he was very upfront about its quirks. He claimed it would change positions overnight. One day its head would be tilted left, the next day right. The real kicker? The previous owner had returned it, pale and shaking, swearing that Chester had whispered his name in the middle of the night. So you have a pre-owned, certified haunted doll that moves on its own and talks. The perfect storm of nope. And someone still bought it. Because of course they did. 16. There's nothing like a mystery to make an old item compelling. A buyer found a small leather-bound diary from the year 1897. It was filled with fascinating daily entries about life over a century ago. They read the entire thing, completely captivated, until they reached the very last entry. The handwriting grew frantic as it described a strange noise outside the writer's window. The final readable sentence said, "I fear this will be my last night. If anyone finds this, know that I..." And that's where it ended. The next page, the final page, had been violently torn out. It's the ultimate 19th century cliffhanger, and it's absolutely infuriating. You're left with an eternal, unsolvable what if. 17. Some things are mysterious and some things are just invitations for trouble you don't need. Case in point, a single high-quality man's leather glove sitting by itself on a table. Tucked inside was a small, neatly folded note with only 6 words. Return to the owner, he knows. That's it. No name, no address, no phone number, just a vague, ominous statement. What does he know? That you didn't tip the waiter enough? That you're the one who keeps stealing your neighbor's newspaper? It could be the start of a spy thriller, or it could be a prank from a bored teenager. Either way, for the low price of getting involved in that, it's a hard pass. 18. This next item proves that some haunted objects like to personalize the experience. It was a beautiful, antique music box. The strange part? It played 2 completely different songs depending on who wound it up. Most people would hear a sweet, gentle lullaby. But every so often, someone would turn the key and be met with a slow, deeply unsettling funeral march. To make things even weirder, one customer swore that when he listened, he heard the lullaby, but with a faint whisper underneath, saying his name. When he told the seller, the guy just nodded and said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." That's not a sales pitch, that's a confession. 19. You buy a grandfather clock for its reliability. This one offered the exact opposite. A vendor was selling a beautiful old clock that refused to be wound, yet it would chime loudly at completely random hours of the day and night. The backstory? It belonged to an old man obsessed with timekeeping, who one day vanished without a trace. His family said the clock chimed one last time at exactly 3:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, and that was the moment he was last seen. It hasn't chimed since. So what you're buying isn't a timepiece. It's a piece of evidence in a century-old cold case that just happens to take up a massive amount of space in your hallway. 20. For every person who has ever felt the pure, unadulterated rage of a missing puzzle piece, this item is for you. Or maybe it's a warning. It was a single, solitary jigsaw puzzle piece, carefully preserved under a small glass dome like a holy relic. The handwritten tag next to it read, "The last piece, always." The seller was frustratingly vague, refusing to say where the rest of the puzzle was. His only explanation was, every time a puzzle is about to be finished somewhere in the world, this piece just appears here. So is this some kind of cosmic failsafe to prevent ultimate satisfaction? What happens if you actually find the puzzle it belongs to and put it in place? Does the universe end? 21. And now for a staple of bizarre Americana, questionable taxidermy. Someone in Texas was proudly selling what they claimed was a genuine two-headed squirrel. It was perfectly preserved, mounted on a plaque, and staring in two different directions at once with its glassy little eyes. The asking price was a cool $300. The seller's big promise was that it was guaranteed to be 100% real, a phrase which, in the world of flea market taxidermy, almost certainly means, I am very good with superglue. Still, for the right person, it's not just a dead animal. It's an investment in future awkward conversations. 22. This next one is for anyone who enjoys being subtly gaslit by their own possessions. It was a broken porcelain doll with a small wind-up key in its back. The seller explained that when you wound it up, a music box inside its chest would play a soft, delicate lullaby. But there was a catch. It would only play when no one was looking at it. The absolute second you turned your head to see it, the music would instantly stop. You could hear it from the other room, but you could never, ever witness it happening. It's the perfect toy for a child you secretly want to drive to the brink of madness. 23. A used vampire hunting kit. The vendor, a man with tired eyes and jittery hands, was selling it for a surprisingly low price. This wasn't some cheap Hollywood prop. It was a heavy wooden box that smelled of dust and fear. The steak wasn't just sharp, there was a dark, flaky substance near the tip he refused to explain. The small bottle of holy water was half empty. The silver bullets weren't polished and shiny. They were dented and tarnished, as if they'd been hastily loaded and unloaded many times. The seller didn't describe it with excitement, but with a quiet warning. It works. That's the problem. The person who bought it didn't look like a collector. They looked like they had an urgent appointment. 24. And because no trip to the bazaar is complete without a stop in Florida, here we are. A seller had a pair of dentures displayed on a velvet cloth. His claim? These weren't just any old teeth, they belonged to an unnamed Hollywood actor from the golden age of the 1950s. While he offered zero proof, the vendor promised they were imbued with the spirit of showbiz. I'm sorry, but nothing screams Hollywood glamour quite like a set of secondhand teeth that probably taste like regret and mothballs. It's the kind of celebrity memorabilia that makes you want to wash your hands just from looking at it. 25. In a dusty box of miscellaneous junk, there was a single playing card from a tarot deck so old it was practically disintegrating. It was the Fool. The card was weathered and torn, but that wasn't the weird part. The problem was the Fool's face. It wasn't static. One moment, he'd have a sly, knowing smirk. You'd look away, and when you looked back, it would be a mask of deep, sorrowful despair. But the seller warned that sometimes it was something worse. Sometimes the face was just a featureless blank, as if the Fool had simply walked out of the card, and you had the distinct, chilling feeling he was now somewhere in the room with you. It's less a piece of cardboard and more a tiny portable portal to Nopeville. 26. This next item proves that some secrets are hidden in plain sight. It was a standard-looking prosthetic leg from the mid-20th century, a little worn but otherwise unremarkable. But the seller, a guy who looked like he had at least 3 illegal side hustles, pointed out a hidden feature. With a quiet click, a spring-loaded panel on the calf opened up, revealing a spacious, hollowed-out compartment inside. The possibilities for its original use are endless, and mostly felonious. Was it for smuggling diamonds, hiding classified documents, or maybe just a very secure place to keep your lunch? Whatever its purpose, you have to admire the craftsmanship while seriously questioning the original owner's life choices. 27. Tucked between copies of Top Gun and Dirty Dancing was a blank VHS tape with a label written in a shaky, desperate hand. It said only 2 words: "Watch alone." The seller, a man with haunted eyes, refused to say what was on it. He just gave a grim warning. It's not for groups. It only works if you're the only one watching. It knows. That day, someone with more courage than sense bought it. The very next morning, the tape was back on the seller's table, looking exactly the same. The person who bought it? They were never seen again. So, for $5, You could buy a mystery movie where the price of admission was potentially your own existence. Seems fair. 28. It was a beautiful antique diary, filled from cover to cover with perfect, flowing cursive that spoke of a gentle, well-educated author. That is, until the very last entry. On the final page, the elegant script devolved into a frantic, barely legible scrawl, which was then violently scratched out with thick black ink. The seller had found it in an abandoned house and tried to decipher the words. He said he held the page up to a lamp and could only make out one terrifying phrase before the bulb above him flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Don't let it find you. You're not just buying a diary. You're buying the end of someone else's story and a very direct warning. 29. Among the grimy tools and chipped china sat a crisp, sealed manila envelope, looking strangely clean. The label, written in neat block letters, read, "Only open after midnight." The seller refused to say what was inside, adding only with a cryptic smile, "If you open it too soon, it won't work. You'll ruin it." Ruin what? Is it a magic spell that fizzles out? A secret inheritance that voids itself? Or is it just a coupon for a free breakfast that doesn't become valid until 12:01 a.m.? The ambiguity is the real horror. No one ever came back to the flea market to say what was inside. Maybe the secret was too good to share. Or maybe they're just too embarrassed to admit they waited all night to open a Denny's coupon. 30. A beautiful grandfather clock was for sale, with one persistent, infuriating problem. The seller, looking completely defeated by it, swore that it always stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. He said he'd reset it every single day, he'd wind it, set the time perfectly, and every morning, without fail, he'd come downstairs to find the hands frozen at that exact time. That's half of the so-called devil's hour for those keeping score at home. No one knows why it did this. At that point, it's not really a clock anymore. It's a monument to a single, terrible minute. And for some reason, the seller thought someone else might want to inherit that very specific, twice-daily headache. 31. It was a cheerful-looking children's book from the 1960s about a group of animal friends on a picnic. But someone had gone through it with a black marker and a whole lot of malice. On every single page, the eyes of every character, the smiling bears, the friendly rabbits, even the cartoon sun in the corner, had been aggressively scribbled out, leaving nothing but dark, empty voids. The seller said he found it in an old attic, right next to a small wooden rocking chair that would still creak on its own when the room was empty. You're not just buying a defaced book. You're buying part of a very sad, very creepy scene. It's a package deal of despair. 32. And just to prove that Louisiana operates on a different plane of existence, one vendor was selling art. Not a painting, not a sculpture, but a full-sized taxidermy alligator. It was propped up in a lawn chair, wearing a pair of what looked like Ray-Ban sunglasses with an unlit cigar clamped firmly in its jaws. The vendor wasn't just selling a dead reptile. He was selling a piece of local legend. With immense pride, he declared, he was a legend in life, and now he's a legend in death. You just know that somewhere out there, there's a man cave with an empty corner and a wife who is about to be very, very disappointed in her husband's latest purchase. 33. Imagine finding a newspaper that is almost completely blank. No headlines, no articles, no sports scores, just empty white pages. Except for one section, the obituaries. That part was fully printed, filled with names, dates, and loving tributes. The seller claimed they found a stack of them in an old attic, all dated for that exact day. The really chilling part? A curious customer pulled out their phone to check. One of the names listed in that strange, blank paper belonged to a person whose death had been reported on the local news just an hour earlier. This wasn't a newspaper. It was a real-time death list. The question is, are the other names predictions? 34. There's nothing quite like the drama of opening a locked trunk that's been sealed for decades. A seller had one, complete with a rusty, old-timey lock. They made a big show of prying it open in front of a small crowd. The trunk creaked open, revealing absolutely nothing. It was empty. Except for one thing sitting right in the middle of the dusty interior. A single, perfectly clean, freshly hand-knitted sock. It looked like it had been made yesterday. There was no hole in the trunk, no way in or out. It was a physical impossibility sitting inside a time capsule. Who put it there? A ghost with a knitting hobby? And more importantly, where in the world is the other one? That's the real crime here. 35. A vendor was selling a beautiful antique Victorian wedding veil, but it came with a behavioral issue. The seller swore she would carefully place it on a mannequin head every single night before closing her stall. But by morning, it had always moved. Sometimes it would be folded neatly on the counter, as if put away by a tidy spirit. Other times it would be crumpled in a heap on the floor, like a ghost had thrown a tantrum. But one morning, she came in to find it draped delicately over her own bedpost in the back room. At that point, it's not just a haunted item. It's a haunted item that's getting a little too familiar. 36. You can find a lot of sad things at a flea market, but this one was a masterpiece of melancholy. It was a full set of pristine wedding invitations, still in their original box. The names, the date, the church, all printed in elegant gold lettering. The only problem? The wedding never happened. When asked what happened, the seller, an old woman who looked like she knew the story all too well, just shook her head and muttered, "No one showed up, not even the groom." You're not just buying fancy paper. You're buying a box full of a single person's worst day, perfectly preserved for posterity. 37. Next up is a classic of the genre, the cursed key with no known lock. A vendor in New York was selling a heavy, rust-covered iron key that he claimed was found in the ruins of an abandoned mansion upstate. According to him, the last person who owned it was plagued by relentless nightmares until they got rid of it. Naturally, he had no proof, just a cryptic warning delivered with a theatrical flair. Use it wisely, or don't use it at all. The best part? Someone actually bought it. They promised the seller they'd be back to report what it unlocked. They never came back. So either they found a door to another dimension, or more likely they just lost it. 38. This item is a special kind of creepy. The object with no origin story. It was a classic carnival prize, a cheap, slightly lopsided stuffed bear with dead plastic eyes. The kind you'd win by knocking over some milk bottles. But the seller swore he never bought it, never won it, and had no idea where it came from. It just appeared at his booth one morning, sitting amongst his other wares, waiting to be sold. It's a trophy without a victory, a prize without a game. Did someone leave it there? Or did the bear itself just decide this was its new home? Either way, you have to admire its initiative. 39. Here we have a perfect, self-contained horror story in a single flea market transaction. A vendor was selling a child's toy phone, still in its original 1980s packaging. Attached to the box was a yellowed, handwritten note, "Do not answer if it rings." A skeptical customer laughed, bought it, and immediately took it out of the box to prove a point. It was just molded plastic, no batteries, no electronics. Impossible. Satisfied, he started to walk away. About 20 feet from the stall, a faint, tinny ringing started coming from his bag. He dropped the whole thing and ran. The seller just stood there, smiling. He'd seen it happen before. 40. Most dolls are designed to be cute or comforting. This one was designed to make you question all of your life choices. It was a porcelain doll, but instead of a sweet smile, it had a fixed, unsettling side-eye glare. Its head was permanently tilted. Its lips were pursed in a thin line. It looked like it had just caught you putting ice in your red wine and was deeply, personally offended. The seller just said, "I don't know why, but it makes people deeply uncomfortable." I think we all know why. Nobody wants to pay money for an inanimate object that silently judges them from a shelf. We already have cats for that. 41. You come across a pristine black leather journal. It feels important, expensive. You open it with anticipation, expecting profound thoughts or dark secrets. You flip through the pages. Page after page is completely, unnervingly blank, until you get to the very last one. Scrawled in the center of the final page, in messy, urgent handwriting, are 4 simple words. "This was a mistake." That's it. No context, no explanation. Just the conclusion to a story you'll never know. What was the mistake? Buying the journal? The life that was supposed to fill it? Or something so terrible that this was the only eulogy it deserved? Frankly, it's the world's shortest, most depressing novel. 42. Taxidermy is already weird, but this one came with a performance review. It was a stuffed cat, forever posed in a vicious attack stance, ready to pounce. Propped in front of it was a handwritten sign that read, "Still watches over the house." A potential buyer, amused, picked it up to inspect it. As they did, a faint but unmistakable hissing noise came from inside the cat's chest. The buyer froze. The seller, without missing a beat, just casually said, "Oh yeah, it does that sometimes when strangers get too close." So, it's not just a decoration, it's a posthumous security system. That's not a haunted object, that's just an employee with a really strong work ethic. 43. And now, for an item that raises far more questions than it answers. A vendor in California was selling a rusty, heavy, and allegedly authentic medieval chastity belt. The sales pitch was that it was from the 1600s and had proven use, claiming it was once worn by a real noblewoman. Okay, let's just glide right past the horrifying hygiene implications for a moment and focus on the real question. Who is the official authenticator of chastity belt usage? Is there a chastity belt verification service that provides certificates? The mind reels. You're not just buying a piece of historical torture equipment, you're buying a very weird and very unprovable story. 44. Mannequins are creepy enough on their own. They are the official residents of the uncanny valley. But one seller found a way to make them infinitely worse. They were selling a vintage mannequin that had unsettlingly realistic eyes. They followed you around the room. The reason? According to the seller, they were actual human-grade glass eyes, salvaged from an old prosthetic. When asked why on earth they would do that, the seller's proud response was, "To make it look more alive." Sir, that is precisely the problem. The goal with mannequins is to make them look less alive, not to turn them into soulless vessels that stare into your very being. 45. Among the usual flea market junk was a simple snow globe. But when the seller shook it, the particles inside didn't look like cheap plastic glitter. The seller let a customer touch the glass, and it was ice cold to the touch. It wasn't water with fake bits inside. It was a miniature, self-contained, perpetual snowstorm. Baffled, one person finally asked the obvious question, "Where does the snow come from?" The seller, a man with eyes that looked a little too old, looked at them and said without a hint of a smile, "Where do you think?" And with that, a charming little trinket becomes a terrifying pocket dimension. 46. Some items don't need a long story to be creepy. They just need a simple, terrifying label. This was a small glass jar filled with dark, rich soil. The handwritten tag tied around it with twine had just 7 words. Taken from a grave. Handle with care. The vendor, when approached, refused to say whose grave it was from, or why exactly it needed to be handled with care. And the most interesting part of this whole encounter? Not a single person asked any follow-up questions. Everyone just collectively nodded, took a wide step around the table, and moved on. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some dirt is better left unbought. 47. A cursed mirror that showed your final reflection. A flea market vendor in Louisiana was selling an ornate Victorian mirror with a chilling twist. It didn't whisper or show ghosts. Instead, when you looked into it for a horrifying split second, your reflection would flash forward, showing you what you would look like at the moment of your death. The seller warned that most people saw themselves as old and frail, but some saw something far more gruesome. It was a guaranteed one-time-only glimpse into your own mortality. Of course it sold, because as terrifying as it is, some people would rather know the ugly truth than live with beautiful uncertainty. 48. An old man in Pennsylvania was selling a pair of antique spectacles from the early 1900s. But he gave a very specific warning. When you put them on, they made everything look wrong. He said that through these lenses, people's faces appeared subtly distorted. Noses were too long, eyes were too far apart, smiles were just a little too wide. One curious but brave customer decided to test them. He put them on, scanned the crowd, and his face went pale. He snatched them off, set them down very carefully on the table, and walked away without saying a single word. The glasses? Still for sale, waiting for someone else who wants to see the world as it really is. 49. Some flea market finds are just odd, while others feel like you're purchasing a responsibility you never asked for. This was one of the latter. A seller in rural Oregon had a large, beautifully hand-drawn map of a local town, framed under glass. But the town on the map didn't quite match reality. It showed buildings that had burned down decades ago and was missing entire new subdivisions. The seller called it a living document. He explained that every now and then, a new red X would appear over one of the properties, drawn in an ink that was somehow already faded and old. And without fail, within a week, that very building would suffer some kind of calamity. A fire, a collapsed roof, a freak gas explosion. He wasn't selling a map. He was selling a supernatural early warning system. As one customer was looking at it, the seller tapped the glass and said, "See that one? That X just showed up this morning." He was pointing to a house on the customer's own street. Suddenly, the $5 price tag seemed way too high. $50. Everyone loves the instant gratification of a Polaroid camera, but one particular model for sale in Ohio offered something else entirely. Instant dread. The vendor claimed this vintage camera didn't capture the present moment. Instead, it captured what would happen a few seconds in the future. He told the story of the last person who bought it. The guy took a test shot of his wife smiling on the couch. The photo that printed out showed her screaming in absolute terror. A moment later, a massive spider fell from the ceiling right into her lap. They returned the camera the very next day. Intrigued, a potential customer asked for a demonstration. The seller just shrugged, aimed the camera at the man's face, and snapped a picture. He waited for it to develop, his smile slowly vanishing. Without a word, he handed the photo to the man and whispered, "I don't know what's about to happen, but you need to leave." Now, 49. And finally, we have an object that simply defies explanation. It was a small glass bottle, corked and sealed with wax. Inside, suspended perfectly in the center, was a single, unmoving drop of dark red liquid. The seller demonstrated by shaking the bottle, turning it upside down, and spinning it. The drop never moved. It never dripped, never shifted, never touched the glass. He claimed he'd even taken it to a scientist, who confirmed it was a liquid, but one that seemed completely immune to the laws of gravity and physics. No one knows what it is. And more importantly, no one has ever been brave enough to open the bottle and find out. So there you have it, 49 items that prove some people will buy absolutely anything. Now, your turn. And I don't want to hear about some cute vintage vase. I want the real stories. That thing in your grandfather's garage you were told never to touch. That object you saw at a yard sale that made the hair on your arm stand up. Spill it in the comments. We know you're holding out on us. And while you're exercising your memories, give this video a like and subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what we dig up next.